He had conquered the world, from Mount Olympus to the Himalayas. Yet they had astounded Alexander the Great. 2 tombs, a roof garden, 2 colossal statues, a temple, and a lighthouse. To Alexander, despite his raft of victories, they were the wonders of the world, of his world, the ancient world. Without our technology, our tools, and in some cases even without use of the wheel, they succeeded in creating such masterful, daring works of art and architecture and engineering that centuries after all but one have perished, they still stagger the imagination. The gods of the Nile, the Fertile Crescent, Olympus, had graced that sparsely populated world with natural wonders of breathtaking beauty.
Behold, you unworthy mortals, the wonders of this earth.
Though frail and finite, the mortals answered with wonders of their own.
These are ours.
The work of our brains and our blistered hands.
Our daring.
Our creative fires.
"2,000 years ago, Philo of Byzantium compiled this list of marvels of the ancient world. There are 7 entries, but why were those wonders fixed at 7? To the ancients, 7 was a sacred number. To them, there were 7 planets in our solar system. There are 400 references to 7 in the Bible. A Jewish ritual candle holder, a menorah, has 7 branches. In the Kabbalah and in the Muslim systems, God and his angels dwell in the farthest of the spheres, the 7th heaven. And the world held 7 wonders, 7 thrusts into the divine by the ancients, which became so mired in legend and frilled with fancy that until the last century, we weren't certain that all 7 had actually existed. We know now that in fact all had stood. Egypt's Great Pyramid, Babylon's legendary Hanging Gardens, the statue of Zeus at Olympus. In Ephesus, the Temple of Artemis. At Halicarnassus, the tomb of Mausolus, the fabled Colossus of Rhodes. And at Alexandria, the world's most famous lighthouse. Discovering them anew is an odyssey that the great Alexander himself might have embarked upon. Of looking into the ravages of natural disasters and of man's vandalism. Of seeking in alluvial mud and the rubble of ruins the glories that had once towered overhead. And the treasure of stories that surrounds them, to envision them with the eye of knowledge, for all but one have been destroyed. That one, the wonder which has stood through 50 centuries of killing sun and storms of the Sahara, before which Alexander stood in awe. The Great Pyramid of Egypt. In seeking this first wonder, one must venture to the southern rim of the Mediterranean world, to the pharaonic kingdom of Egypt, and brave a danger more terrifying than any which confronted Ulysses on his perilous odyssey. Cairo traffic and Cairo energy charging from this urban gateway to Egypt. Its myriad minarets bristling in the shadows of skyscrapers. A colossal market town where Africa, Asia, and Europe meet, talking, mingling, bargaining, jostling, hustling, and hawking. The river that runs through this city is its heart, its lungs, its lease on life, the Nile, from whose overflow sprang civilization as we know it. The deepest, most ancient cultural mud from which we grew, the Egypt of the pharaohs. The seeker braves the desert, the torrid sun, the blasts of wind-whipped sand, and suddenly, on the horizon, they appear as distant mountain peaks. With swelling emotion, the seeker draws closer and then stands overpowered, almost stupefied. The only remaining wonder of the ancient world stands in awe as the ancient Greek Herodotus stood in awe some 2,500 years ago, as Julius Caesar stood here in awe, as Napoleon stood in awe. These pyramids have been called the Mountains of Pharaoh and the Granaries of Joseph. Stargazers have called them the world's oldest astronomical observatories, tombs that tell time, huge sundials. What they are man's most enduring monuments to our longing for immortality. The four sides of the Great Pyramid of Cheops face exactly the 4 points of the compass. Built of 2.25 million limestone blocks weighing up to 2.5 tons apiece, its base covers 13 acres, and it rises to the height of a 42-story skyscraper. It took 100,000 workmen 30 years to finish the job. It took 10 years just to build the ramp up which the stones were moved into position. Laborers worked on the pyramids just 3 months of each year when the Nile's flooding brought farming to a standstill. Tools, the everyday tools of construction workers in pharaonic Egypt. Though 4,000 years old, they're still usable. In the slopes of Mogatum, one can see where the stones were quarried and then transported on sledges. Some of these sledges have been preserved, even the ropes they were pulled with. These sledges were sufficiently sturdy to haul a monument. This drawing is based on old Egyptian descriptions of how the stone blocks were raised. Contemplating these three greatest of the pyramids, Cheops, Khephren, and Mycerinus, Napoleon calculated,
There are stones in these three pyramids sufficient to build a wall around all of France.
Careful scrutiny of the Great Pyramid reveals that there were no less than 3 changes of construction plans during its building. Whatever the changes, it has stood for 50 centuries, thrusting in its finitude toward a creature comfort eternity for the pharaoh Cheops. To ancient Egyptians, life's fulfillment was the journey into death. To enjoy an afterlife, 2 conditions, rigid and unchanging, need be met. The body must be intact, hence mummification. Secondly, the spiritual double of the deceased, called Ka, must be provided. In the sarcophagus, with the accoutrements of the living, food, furniture, stately objects. Cheops was hungry for immortality. The embalming process for a pharaoh such as he took 70 days. He was prepared for his voyage into the afterlife. An entrance has been cut into the north face, through an opening made by a greedy caliph in search of treasures inside. The air is stale. The gloomy corridors are so steep that visitors must nearly double over as they crouch their way upwards to the burial chamber. And there's always the danger of being locked in. It has happened. At last, the pharaoh's final resting place, a stone sarcophagus set into the floor of a chamber built of pink Aswan granite. The tomb is empty, the chamber stripped. Almost as imposing as Cheops is the pyramid of the pharaoh Khephren. At one time, these pyramids were completely faced with polished limestone that sparkled like glass. Some of this limestone casing still glistens at the top of Khephrens. For centuries now, local guides and hawkers have been hounding visitors with information and artifacts. They're inescapable. In the 1880s, one pesky guide pursued Mark Twain so persistently that Twain offered him $100 if he'd jump off the pyramid head first. Facing the east of the new day's sun, this stupendous hybrid, its body that of a noble lion, its face that of a royal human, the Sphinx, Romans dubbed it the god of death. Arabs, a father of fear. If its purpose was to frighten away thieves from the treasure-laden tombs, it was a purpose as lost as its nose. Though the pyramids were the best-guarded tombs of all time, robbers with greater regard for the blessings of here and now than for those of the afterlife did succeed in breaking the seals and stripping the sepulchres of their riches, mummies and all. Tomb robbing went on for centuries, down to our own era. And some of the most blatant robbers were those who rifled the tombs for museums in Europe and America. In 1922, Howard Carter, an Englishman, and his patron Lord Carnarvon, broke through a sealed door to discover untouched, never before violated, the tomb of Tutankhamun. With all its treasure intact, perhaps the most splendid archaeological discovery of all time. Some are convinced that a curse hung over that tomb. Within 7 years, a dozen people connected with the find died strange deaths. Only 5 months after the discovery, Lord Carnarvon was scratching a mosquito bite on his left cheek. Blood poisoning set in. Shortly thereafter, he died of infection in a Cairo hotel nearly 2 hours past midnight. Unaccountably, all the city lights went out. Doctors who examined Tutankhamun's mummy discovered a scab-like mark on the left cheek, on the spot corresponding to where Lord Carnarvon had been fatally bitten by the mosquito.
In gazing at the water-trapping devices and the blazing brick kilns of Iraq, we try to envision those legendary gardens as Alexander had seen them, in verdant bloom.
Ancients believed that the biblical Eden, paradise, was located somewhere in Asia Minor's Fertile Crescent, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which the Greeks called Mesopotamia. To us, it's Iraq. It's here that seekers can find remains of the second wonder of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Babylon itself was so stupendous a city, it could rightly have been chosen one of the wonders of the ancient world.
O opulent city standing beside the waters,
exclaimed the prophet Jeremiah. In the millennium before Christ, it spread over 2,500 acres of a large plain, the river Euphrates winding through its downtown, prestigious and pleasure-loving, a city-state of millions, the largest in the world.
Babylon hath been a golden cup that made all the earth drunken.
To partake fully of its splendor, one need parade down the processional way of Marduk and enter through this most magnificent of the city's 8 gates, dedicated to Ishtar, goddess of carnal love, as Nebuchadnezzar did, and King Darius, and Alexander the Great, to clashing cymbals and fanfares of trumpets. There was an ancient argument that this processional way should have been named Second Wonder of the World. For all its splendor, Babylon was a brick town. Iraqi brickmakers still turn out bricks as the ancients made them here almost 30 centuries ago. Bricks of clay and water, kneaded by hand. They're dried in long rows in the sun. Most of Babylon was built of such bricks, which, of course, have long since disintegrated into dust. But those structures built of bricks fired in kilns have endured down to our day. Mighty Babylon was built of bricks, billions of bricks, enough bricks to connect the earth to the moon, or to wrap the globe with them 15 times at its widest point. Here, civilization reaches back over 4,000 years. Sickles and knives, hoes and axes, fish hooks that seem as modern as today's. Letters written on clay tablets inserted in clay envelopes and franked with clay postage stamps. Here, kings and nobles wallowed in a worship of fleshpot gods, of whom their epic of creation sang,
"The gods grow drunk with drinking, their bodies are joyful, they shout aloud, their hearts exult."
Babylon's far-reaching fame permeated the ancient world like a heady perfume, her wanton luxury the envy of harsh and plainer peoples.
The golden helmets of her swains,
The golden bangles that grace the sweetly oiled limbs of her courtesans.
It was in the throne room in the magnificent southern palace that Belshazzar's feast was held, a feast described by Daniel in the Bible as a riotous, profane banquet suddenly halted by the finger of God.
and it was in Babylon that 3 young Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were cast into the flames of a fiery furnace for being faithful to the God of Israel. Because of their faith, they were untouched by the raging fire.
It is the land of King Sargon, who in biblical times deported the Israelites to Assyria. The land that saw the death of Alexander the Great. It is a land of ziggurats, temple towers of the ancients in the form of a terraced pyramid, the tie between heaven and earth, an architectural scheme used by the Muslims of Iraq for their minarets. This is the site of the Tower of Babel, which was the ziggurat of Babylon. In this urban marvel, constructed almost entirely of bricks, one stunning creation was built on a stone foundation, on the summit of the citadel.
The Hanging Gardens, a structure of tiers rising one above the other to the height of the city's battlements. The garden's walls, which held the amassed planting soil's great weight, were 22 feet thick. They ascended skyward in rising terraces. Lofty trees 50 feet high and 12 feet in circumference gave cool shade from the desert sun.
Devices raised water from the river in great amounts for soaking the soil and refreshing the groves with moisture.
Leafy crowns of the topmost trees caressed the vaulted blue of the sky. A distant spectator of these groves would suppose them to be growing on mountains.
Some historians attribute this remarkable construction to Nebuchadnezzar, because his wife, who came from Media, longed for the scenery of her homeland.
Another tradition insists that they were the pleasure gardens of the legendary Semiramis, a queen of Assyria.
In our age, the very existence of the gardens was in doubt until the discovery by German archaeologist Robert Kaldewey of the vaulted building and pumps by which water was scooped out of the Euphrates River. Water was the lifeline. Developers of the ancient world forced these pleasure gardens to bloom in the Mesopotamian desert, the way today's developers use Hoover Dam to foster the blooming of the Las Vegas pleasure palaces on the wastes of Nevada. Water is still scooped from the Euphrates, but what remains of the second wonder of the world? Fragments of stone and brick, the great trees and luxuriant green are a parching, choking dust. What the desert cannot sustain in nature, it destroys. Indeed, today Babylon is a dust in the hot, stinging winds of Iraq. And if one listens, one can hear in its moaning the words of the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah.
Babylon shall become ruins, a haunt of wolves. Her cities shall become waste places, a land dried up and desert. Enthroned in his temple at Olympia, Zeus, king of the gods, glares down at us puny mortals. His voice is thunder, his eyes the fires of heaven.
The Hellenic world. A quest for the third of the ancient wonders draws the seeker to an old, old land, crested by the shadowy mountains of Homer, still wild, and hedged by a welter of islands in their blue and violet seas. Greece. The seeker's Grecian gateway, Athens. For more than 1,000 years, the resounding heartbeat of Western culture, lying in a valley between two peaks, Mount Lycabettos, topped by the gleaming white chapel of St. George, and a rocky citadel called the Acropolis, the white marble temple of Athena, the Parthenon, even in ruins of unparalleled beauty and form. Only a stone's throw from here, Paul the Apostle preached the new religion of an unknown God. The modern capital is partly on and partly off the site of ancient Athens. Yet tramping over these hills, one breathes the air that sustained Pericles and Sophocles. Noisy, strenuous, energetic, that's the Athens of today. In these respects, it resembles ancient Athens, whose citizens were a scrappy lot, whether haggling over a bargain or arguing a subtle point of philosophy. But one point upon which those ancient Greeks agreed, the sacredness of Olympia. Here stood the shrine of Zeus, king of the pagan gods. And it was here, with a long tradition of athletic contests, particularly chariot racing, that the Olympic Games began.
King Oenomaus, who reigned near Olympia in the dim, distant past, had a daughter, and his daughter had many suitors.
Warned in a prophecy that he would be killed by his future son-in-law, the king announced that he would give his daughter to the suitor who could beat him in a chariot race. If the suitor lost, death. Well, one suitor after another lost the race and was put to death. Then young Pelops took up the challenge. In their race, the king himself was killed when he crashed his chariot.
Pelops claimed the lovely daughter and the throne.
Some reason that it was those chariot races that certified Olympia as the capital of athletic competitions. Others contend that it was that heroic survivor of perilous labors, Heracles, who got the athletic games going here, in honor of his father, Zeus. 175 miles north of Olympia, on the confines of Thessaly, rises Mount Olympus, soaring to a height of almost 10,000 feet. To the ancient Greeks, it was the highest mountain in the world, its peak charged with religious awe. This was the home of the gods. And the unquestioned king over this court of divinities was Zeus. Zeus was sovereign, hurler of thunderbolts. His laughter could cause the earth to tremble. With all due respect, he was the old man, of godly nature, yet creaking with human weaknesses, a meddler in mortal affairs, a woman chaser who'd never take no for an answer, even if it meant transforming himself into a swan or a bull, and a maker of alibis to his long-suffering wife, the goddess Hera, who fell into jealous rages. Since Olympia was more accessible to mortals than the divine heights of Olympus, it became Zeus's second home and the center of his worship for over 1,000 years. Olympia was a shrine, not a town. Most of its buildings had been built to accommodate pilgrims. Its focal point was a temple, a grand Doric structure, the holy of holies of the cult image of Zeus. Tall as a 3-story house, this was the third wonder of the ancient world.
On his head lies a wreath of olive sprays. In his right hand he holds a figure of victory. In his left a scepter upon which an eagle is perched. His flesh is of ivory, and his robe and sandals are of gold. His throne is studded with precious jewels.
All the aspects of Zeus were found in this image.
Protector of cities.
God of friendship and comradeship.
Protector of suppliants.
God of hospitality.
Giver of increase.
This jug was uncovered near the temple. It's inscribed, "I belong to Phidias." Indeed, it was the master sculptor Phidias who in the 5th century BC created this great image. It's told that when Phidias finished the work, he asked Zeus if it was to his liking. Immediately, a thunderbolt crashed to the temple floor, meaning yes.
His head almost touched the ceiling. If Zeus were to have stood up, he would have gone through the roof.
Ancient Greeks were diverse, argumentative, Athenians, Spartans, always scrapping with each other. It was their devotion to Zeus and to the games held at Olympia that welded them together as one people. To them, Olympia was a composite of St. Peter's, the Rose Bowl, Wimbledon, and Mecca. Wars were halted for the games. Greeks from over the civilized world traveled to Olympia to take part. They numbered the years from the beginning of those games, calculated to be, in our numbering, 776 BC. Zeus is dead. His great image, a wonder of the world, was destroyed in a fire in Constantinople, where it had been moved some 850 years after its creation. But the games that were that testy old god's pleasure live on in the Olympic Games of today, preserving the ancient Greek ideal of developing human beings to their highest level in harmony of mind and body. Historians of ancient Greece and Rome who determined which of the man-made marvels were chosen as the seven wonders of the world knew nothing of the Great Wall of ancient Chung Quo, which we call China, or the cave paintings at Ajanta in Bharat, now known as India, or they might have increased the number to accommodate wonders of the ancient Orient. The seven wonders were of the world as known to the insatiably curious Greeks, places such as Persia, now known as Iran, whose invading armada of 1,000 warships was destroyed by the Greek fleet. Zeus of Olympia and the remaining four wonders were all outcroppings of the Hellenic world. Babylon of the Hanging Gardens and the Egypt which saw the building of the pyramids were to the ancient Greeks, as to us, dead civilizations, whose cultures, along with those of the Medes and Persians, were barbarous, or so thought the Greeks. Why this smugness, this haughtiness on the part of these noisy people? Because Greeks were free to make their laws, to run their own affairs. To them, the state existed for its citizens. In all other cultures that they knew of, the citizen existed for the state. He was the toy of tyrants. The democratizing influence of the city-states of the Greek mainland and her Aegean Isles flowed to the Asian coast. And here sprang cities, Greek cities. The seeker may glimpse these urban ruins in the quest for the fourth wonder of the ancient world. Ancient Miletus, where the scientist Thales lived, and his pupil Anaximander, first to draw a map of the world. Miletus was a magnet. An oracle here milked secrets from the future and dribbled them into the ears of eager petitioners. Even Croesus, richest king of the ancient world, came begging to this oracle. Smyrna, a name that grocers associate with a variety of fig. Smyrna, one of the oldest cities in Asia Minor, lies in modern Turkey and is now called Izmir. Priene dates from the 4th century BC and was the beneficiary of city planning before being built, a rare thing in the ancient world. For the Greeks, a town was more than public buildings and private dwellings. It was a polis, meaning a community of citizens. Citizens who voted, who worshipped.
Great is Artemis of the Ephesians.
For centuries they thronged here, multitudes from over the Greco-Roman world.
At last our eyes rest upon her temple, the nurturing Artemis of Ephesus.
In time, the seeker questing for the fourth wonder will arrive at the small Turkish town of Seljuk, and a landscape of which Homer wrote.
Swans with long necks are flying left and right, boasting with white wings.
3,000 years ago, the splendid city of Ephesus stood here, prosperous and powerful.
This was the sacred earth of the goddess Artemis, the Diana of the Ephesians, and the site of her great temple.
There was nothing here, just a vast denuded plain, when in 1863, British archaeologist John T. Wood began digging for evidence of the temple. After a year's work, he uncovered the Upper Agora, one of the main squares of the town. It went back to the 2nd century BC, but Ephesus was 1,000 years older. He uncovered the evidence of streets, which 2,000 years ago were lined by columns. Evidence of a marble way, a clue to the wealth and grandeur of Ephesus, which grew to become a prime metropolis of the Roman Empire. Of a lower Agora, where the city's most talked about citizen, Heraclitus, sprang his philosophy on the world. After having dug for 3 years, Wood began excavating the city's ancient theater, which had been buried by time without a trace.
It is you, O king, you who brings a plague upon the children of Candace.
It could hold 30,000 spectators. 6 months later, he uncovered writings on columns. In his eagerness, he forged ahead breathlessly, almost blindly. After spending precious time in misreading clues and wrong-way digging, he was at last tremblingly approaching his goal.
The great excitement I felt when making the discovery. I was seized by a high fever, yet I paid no attention to it. I would not stop working.
On the last day of 1869, after having searched for 7 years, John T. Wood discovered in the alluvial mud the remains of the great temple of Artemis of Ephesus, the fourth wonder of the ancient world.
An Egyptian temple was the house of a god, but a Greek temple was the house of the soul.
This vast, gleaming marble building, its columns 60 feet high, slender and beautifully fluid, resembling the folds of a woman's gown, and the volutes of the Ionic capital suggesting locks of a woman's hair.
At the base of this column is the sculpture of the god Hermes. An inscription says that it was a gift to the temple by King Croesus.
Of this temple, Philo of Byzantium wrote 2,000 years ago,
He who has laid eyes on it once will be convinced that the world of the immortal gods has moved from heaven to earth.
Artemis was complex. A moon goddess of the Amazons, her worship went back to the sacrificial rituals of primitive man. She was the great she-bear, Ursa Major, ruler of the stars.
In European Greece, and later in Rome, where she was called Diana, meaning the goddess Anna, Artemis was known as the twin sister of Apollo, vigorous but virginal, a lover of the chase but chaste, a kind of divine tomboy who gave herself only to the pleasures of hunting.
One day Actaeon, a young huntsman, came upon Artemis bathing in a fountain. He watched, stunned by her beauty.